Hello, I'm Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz and happy to be here to introduce Russell Cobb, the author. I originally come from Oklahoma and I really love the librarians of Oklahoma, and the Oklahoma Book Award is just honors really important books. And I think this one is one of the most important. I congratulate Russell on the award. You're a gifted storyteller, and combined with your research, as well as weaving in your own story, you have crafted a book destined to become a classic. So where are you, Russ?
Well, thank you, Roxanne. I really appreciate that. It's a real honor because when I encountered your book, Red Dirt, growing up Okie, maybe 15 years ago, it was really one of those books that you pick up and just changes everything, the way you see yourself and your identity and the way you kind of look at your surroundings. So it's just a real privilege to be here. And thank you so much to the Department of Libraries and Kathy and Connie for hosting this conversation. I'm delighted and honored for the award. I'm in the what we call Treaty 6 territory, land of the traditional land of the Stoney Nakoda, the Cree, the Nehiyaw people in Alberta, in Canada, Western Canada, which is considerably farther north than Oklahoma, but it's all good. We're here via Zoom, so we can have this conversation. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Well, I thought I'll start by asking you, what if we reframe the history of Oklahoma entirely? What if we recontextualize the coming of Oklahoma statehood to be part of a larger story of the United States imperialism around that turn of the century? The United States invaded the Philippines in 1898, around the same time, and with similar motives as Oklahoma land runs and the completion of the Dawes Commission. After that, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines became US colonies, where the populations did not speak English and where Western capitalist values were anathema. So maybe instead of seeing Oklahoma as in the musical of a brand new state gonna treat you great, might we not see Oklahoma as another site of conflict between the United States and United States imperialism and indigenous or Creole spaces?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I really do think that there is a desperate need to recontextualize what Oklahoma really is and its foundings. You know, I grew up in Oklahoma believing it was just part of the American heartland, just another flyover state. The great American desert trapped between where the real action was, in California and New York. But I totally do not see it that way anymore. I agree. I see it as a kind of an internal colony that was created in this first imperial stage of the American empire. And I think that it's not a stretch to see it in a more global way. It's true. It's when you look at the War of 1898 and the fight against Spain, that's when the United States really truly did, there was no doubt about it. I mean, for the perpetrators of that war, that the American empire was on. And I think what Oklahoma was at the time is an interesting illustration of that, because as I'm sure most people know, it was sort of the last place that so many tribes and nations had been kind of backed into with this promise that would be theirs for as long as the the waters would run and the sun would shine. And the seizing of that territory really shows that imperial urge to seize land and resources. Now, where it gets interesting is that I think that created a sort of creolized culture where, Okies of all sorts they live together, not always in harmony, not always a peaceful coexistence, but an existence that overlapped layers and layers of Black townships and the five tribes and poor white Southerners, later Eastern oil men, all kind of in this same space. So it's an interesting place for sure.
Yes, that larger system is clearly a colonialist, and I think the guardianship system of Native American land was one of the most egregious attempts to seize land from indigenous peoples and simply transfer it to white men. Why are the machinations of that system not better known and contextualized as colonialism?
I think the guardianship system still remains one of those things that's not quite understood, or definitely not as well understood as it should be. And one of the things I really wanted to look into in the book was exactly how it worked, because it seems incredible from the contemporary point of view that the government, that the judicial system, so the county, especially county judges, would be so embedded with industry, especially the oil industry, to a lesser extent agriculture, timber, coal, in taking control of resources that had been transferred legally to individual citizens of the five tribes. And I think that's important to remember, because one of the big justifications for turning Indian Territory into the state of Oklahoma was that the Dawes Commission would give, private property and the legal title to the land. So it was like, well, now they'll get all the benefits of the Western capitalist system that the white settlers have gotten. So it was supposed to be this level playing field, and it was absolutely the opposite. And the guardianship system, to me, is that thing that made that thing that made this system so unequal. And we're living with that today, that you can that so many of these landmen, oilmen, etc., took control of those resources so quickly. Like it's not like it took generations. It's not just people would die and then part of it would be transferred on. It was like from 1907 to within a decade, the majority of those allotments were gone, despite a whole series of restrictions and laws that were supposed to be passed to, quote unquote, protect Native Americans. It was still gone. And so I think that, like, I think that my book, in a way, I try to address exactly how that happened and the justifications for it. And but I think a lot of work still needs to be done. I don't think we're quite there in understanding how vast the system was.
Yes, your book certainly puts it into a perspective that I think is really much better for the conversation than past attempts to explain it. But you spend a lot of time researching, writing about the transition of Tulsa from a Creek Muskogee town, to the oil capital of the world, as they call themselves, the Saudi Arabia of the United States. But what stories about the oil capital do you want to highlight? And why do you think Tulsa remains so nostalgic for its Art Deco era times of fantastic wealth?
It's really interesting that Tulsa has changed so much, since I was a kid. When growing up there, being a third or fourth generation Tulsan, still knew nothing about the Tulsa Race Massacre, didn't know about it till I was in my 20s. Things are changing. There's a lot of dialogue and learning that's going on that was not happening 20 years ago. But I still think that we don't have the context, Tulsans in particular, and Oklahomans at large don't have the context to understand the ways in which this birth of an industry, of the American oil industry, is so central to the story of Oklahoma and particularly of Tulsa. And we understand that, but we don't connect it to the darker side of the history. In particular, not just the Tulsa Race Massacre, but the Osage Reign of Terror, the dispossession of Native American allotments, the destruction of Black townships, lynchings. You go on and down the list, because those things would not, I don't think really that scale would have happened were it not for the central location of the oil. I mean, you can't it's like hard to imagine how important oil was now, because now oil is so global. It's such a global market, and they're finding oil, in every nook and cranny you can think of in the deep sea ocean. But in 1914, as the world was gearing up for World War I, there were not that many oil finds, and Oklahoma was the nation's leading producer of oil. So you have the world, or at least the United States, looking right at Oklahoma, and particularly right outside of Tulsa, Glenpool, and Creek County, to fuel the war machine, right? The war machine for World War I. So it was so central. And I think that, to me, I want to really tell that story, the kind of more complete context, where we can't just have, now it's like we have the Tulsa Race Massacre, and that's really terrible, and we're thinking about it, and we're researching it, and we're all reconciling with that, and that's great. Like it's very moving to see that. But on the other hand, you can't just say there was this horrible little thing that happened over here, but then our identity is still oil capital of the world. I think oil capital of the world is, unfortunately, the reason that these crimes, such as the Osage Reign of Terror, Tulsa Race Massacre, et cetera, were as violent as they were. And that's not because there's something awful, particularly heinous and awful, about Tulsans or Oklahomans. I love Oklahomans. I feel like they're all my extended family. You see this everywhere in the world. I mean, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia, Iraq, anywhere in the world you find this intense concentration of oil and oil wealth, you'll find those massive social inequities, violence, discrimination, and sexism.
Yes, absolutely. But another thing about Tulsa, you mentioned an implicit debate around narratives of the Tulsa Race Massacre, which you've also mentioned. But some historians stress the spontaneous violence and mob mentality of the white invaders, while another contingent of historians point to something like a conspiracy to attack and burn down Greenwood. Where do you come down on this debate? And it's really been, in the press a lot in the last year. If there was a conspiracy, who might have been behind it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And again, like I'm glad we're talking about this, because I think it's part of that larger context. Now, a lot of historians actually have, when they start to go into the Tulsa Race Massacre, what led to it, they will point to what I alluded to earlier, which is the very fervent, rabid nationalism that was ginned up around World War One. And the paranoia was not just racism. I mean, there was that obviously, but there was also this sort of fear of organized labor, of socialists, of foreigners coming in and organizing. And so, the famously or infamously, the lynching that took place before the arrest of Dick Rowland was of a suspected wobbly. So, I think that there's still a lot out there that we don't know. The Home Guards, or this sort of paramilitary organization that was founded in Tulsa, and there's a guy, a historian, Randy Hopkins, who's been looking into this a lot. The Knights of Liberty, the Councils of Defense, obviously the Ku Klux Klan. There was a lot, and there was a lot of organization, I think, that unfortunately we don't have the actual records of a pre-planned, if not war exactly the way it took place, at least a pre-planning in terms of a organization of hostility that would be directed. And just look at that whistle, that just inspires, like, sends chills down my spine to think that this whistle that people used to think was a train whistle, but now it's coming out that it was probably set up by one of those councils of defense in the case that there was some sort of socialist uprising, which of course there had been a socialist uprising, the Green Corn Rebellion in Oklahoma, so they weren't totally wrong. But in case something like that happened, that they used that siren to set off the real push to destruction of Greenwood. So I think, a lot of those things are just sort of interconnected. And I don't think it's sometimes a conspiracy is more than a theory. Let's just put it that way.
That's and sometimes they're real conspiracies too. Well, a very important thing about Oklahoma, I grew up myself as a hardcore Southern Baptist in rural Oklahoma. But you write about the intersection of religion and politics. Oklahoma is pretty much like the rest of the country becoming more secular. All the polls that are taken, there are fewer and fewer people who say they go to church or identify with a church or religion. Yet these mega churches retain so much power and influence and keep growing. Why is this particular brand of capitalist, what you call seed faith, evangelical Christianity, so influential in Oklahoma?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure why it took root in Oklahoma, but I mean, Oral Roberts and his ministry was, as far as I know, really the pioneer of turning what was a sort of evangelical notion of preparing for the end of time, preparing for the second coming of Jesus, into a sort of business plan. So let's start thinking about wealth not as something unholy or something as sullied by the filthy lucre that sullies the temple and kicking out the money changers, as Jesus recommended, but rather as something that is godly. So just really flipping the script. Oklahoma, we pioneered that. Preachers, pastors, and have done quite well by themselves preaching that gospel. And why is it, and why did it take root here? I mean, Oklahoma's always been such a religious place, like, as you noted, and you've written about deeply, Roxanne, like, as you've also written about, like, religion has wavered in and how it speaks to our social situations. There's a lot of great work out there about early Oklahoma history and the work of Christianity as kind of tied into a social gospel that's much more what we'd recognize as socialism, or at least social democracy. And then the turn, in the 1970s towards that sort of seed faith gospel has been, well, it's incredibly powerful. It's an incredibly powerful narrative, right? I mean, especially if you're down and out, if you're struggling, if you're going paycheck to paycheck, you can't pay your insurance, you can't even afford to fix your car breaks down and you need your car to get to work. We're told, pray on it,
Yeah.
and if you've donated, if you've shown your faith, maybe that will be rewarded. And that's even gone all the way up to practices in the state government. When things get rough, the price of oil goes down, or there's a pandemic, let's have a statewide day of prayer as the answer for it. And it's really interesting, to go back to the original comment that you had, that Oklahoma, like the rest of the nation, well, like the rest of the entire world, frankly, is becoming more and more secular. So it'll be interesting to see how those things play out, because right now they're so rooted in our intersection of religion, politics, and daily life.
On a major part of the political divide, as it's called right now. But turning to something else that I certainly didn't know about, or this important person, you point out that the real turning point for you in writing this book was understanding the history of Takabachi. So who was Takabachi, and why do not more Oklahomans know his story? Is this one of the many instances of cover-ups of Indigenous histories in Oklahoma and beyond?
Takabachi is really, I think, a figure that everyone in Oklahoma should know about. And I am quite ashamed, I guess I should say, to know that I grew up, 2 blocks from his cabin in the Maple Ridge area of Tulsa. Never heard his name until about 3 years ago. Now, I do think it was a cover-up, but before I get to that, let me just tell you just a really brief sketch of his life. It's just remarkable. Takabachi was born in Sugar Creek, today Alabama. So it was the traditional lands of the Creek people, Muskogee Creek people. And when he was a teenager, he was forced out on the Trail of Tears from Alabama, with the rest of his tribal town, Tulsi Logaboja. The Logaboja people were forcibly removed, and they found this little bend in the Arkansas River that became, Tulsa, and they shortened it down from Tulsi to Tulsi Town, to eventually Tulsa. And then he, part of that Logaboja tribal town, they recreated the tribal town that they had been forced to leave from Alabama. Takabachi was a central part of that. So the refounding of the tribal town in the 1830s, he would have been a young man. Many years later, the Civil War comes along. Takabachi is a loyal, what they call a loyal Creek. So he fought for the Union, and in fact fought bitter battles that pushed where the Confederates, the Creek Confederates, along with a Texas Confederate, pushed them all the way up to Kansas, where Abraham Lincoln had personally assured them that as loyal Creeks, they would be protected, housed, fed, everything in the winter at Fort Row. None of that aid ever came. It was just a total, the death toll per capita was actually worse than the Trail of Tears on that, what they call the Trail of Blood on Ice. So Takabachi fights in that war, comes all the way back after the Civil War, restarts the tribal town, participates in Creek government, lives to be somewhere between 100 and 110 years old. As an old man, he's forced to allot his land where he's been living, most of his life, along the banks of the Arkansas River. Today, that's the heart of Tulsa's gathering place, that beautiful gem of a park, which contains absolutely no reference whatsoever to Takabachi. even though it was his land, and that he tried to pass that land down to his grandchildren, because by the time Tuggabugie died, his children had already even died. And he had some of his grandchildren, he tried to pass it down to them. And he was forced on his deathbed to write a different will that again had a guardian, and the guardian made sure that those grandchildren, their interest in that land was dispersed, was taken away. They were paid like a paltry sum, I think of $1,000 a piece. And then a few years later, that land is opened up to white settlement. And I learned this, very recently. And for me, I guess it was a changing point in my life, because when I learned that, and I learned the depths of the swindle and the links that people had gone to cover it up, I just felt an incredible weight of responsibility to make right in any way I could for that wrong.
Well, I certainly hope that your book will bring about more writing, more research on this really important individual that do not, like many other things in Oklahoma, do not show up in our textbooks or become even research interests at higher levels. Well, you write that George Milburn suggested the state was an aberration among US states, while Angie DeBow said it was a US story in a compressed timeline. Is Oklahoma a microcosm of the United States, or do you think it is truly an anomaly?
I go back and forth on this, and I used to think it was a total aberration, because it just seemed like when I went to, Kansas or Texas or Arkansas, we just seemed to be so weird compared to those places, and it couldn't really explain it. But I've reread Angie DeBow, and I've been thinking obviously a lot about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and I think I'm flip-flopping once again. I've flip-flopped numerous times, and I used to be the Milburn, what did he call it? It was like a platypus, It was just an abomination of like mammals and reptiles and all this stuff that made no sense together. And then Angie DeBow is like, oh, it's just the story of the United States, just instead of like 400 years, it's 100 years. And I think I'm flipping back over to the Angie DeBow view of things. But Roxanne, I'm really curious what you think about that. What's your take on it?
Well, I think it sounds funny, but I think it is actually both, not either or. It is that, U.S. was colonizing Native people all over the continent in that 100 Years' War from founding until the Wounded Knee Massacre as a marker. And that happened in Oklahoma in more compressed time, taking all the land. Because even while all that happened in the rest of the country, that land was supposedly secure in Oklahoma. And there were no, other than the Civil War, there were no wars against the Native people. But then it all exploded, in this compressed time period, really from 1907 to 1925 or so. So I think, I think it's probably both. It is so different. I tell you, you can come out to California, where I live, and go to the Central Valley, and you're in Oklahoma because of the Dust Bowl. So there is one other place, and there are Native people from there, and there are Black people, and there are the white. You only hear about the white Okies, but it's the music, everything, they brought with them. So it's just like in every bad, it's also the red part of the state that, is the Republican part. part of the state.
Yeah, I like that. It's so contradictory too. And it's speaking of that, like I didn't even realize until very recently that that iconic image of the migrant mother that Dorothea Lange took, that she is Cherokee.
Yeah, Cherokee woman. Yeah.
It's like I
I
think a
met her.
lot of that we don't have that. It's what
No,
if we were to rethink about the Okie migration as kind of yet another displacement of Native people? Because I think if you like, I agree. I think if you probably drilled down and really understood the demographics, I'd find that you'd probably find that a lot of them weren't white, and maybe some of them tried to pass as white because, as we
right.
know, there was so much discrimination already against Okies. That
Absolutely.
they were coming and
Yeah.
taking our jobs, and they were filthy and dirty. Maybe that was yet another reason to try to pass as much as possible.
Yeah. Well, now I want to ask you about Oklahoma as if not the hotbed of 1910s radicalism, from the Socialist Party to the industrial workers of the world, and even the more radical working class union, which had a role in the Green Corn Rebellion. My grandfather Dunbar, who was a veterinarian, was a member and very active in the Socialist Party in Canadian County, central Oklahoma. So let's discuss how and why socialism took hold in Oklahoma and why it fell apart and is hardly even remembered at all. It's pretty much purposely suppressed, it seems like.
Right. Yeah. I remember reading that in your book, in Red Dirt years ago, and just being, what really, socialist in rural Oklahoma, no less. And indeed it was like, now when you look at the political map of Oklahoma, you see this, well, the cities are maybe trending more liberal, but the rural areas are becoming even more conservative. But I think we don't, we need to always rethink our assumptions. And when we go back 100 years or even more, you find that equation was flipped, and the cities were kind of these strongholds of like business, capital, banking, and the countryside was where the real radical left-wing activism was. And I think you probably know more about this than me. My understanding of it is a lot of it had to do with this suspicion of corporations, of railroads, of monopolies, of people like John D. Rockefeller, who would control finance, and that there was an upsurge in cooperatives, which still exists, but it was more of rather than just a cooperative of people, it became kind of more of an ethic, right? That you took care of one another, and that sort of social gospel resounded with a kind of a certain teaching within Christianity that then, found people and spoke to people as they struggled as small farmers. A lot of them were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, and they could find this common cause with Black freedmen or Native Americans, and it was sort of like us. I think that to me, I don't know, and I'm totally curious what you think. To me, it sounds like the turning point is World War I, and that hysteria about Bolsheviks and communists and foreign agents, and somehow that kind of business elite was able to take this homegrown cooperative social movement and label it as a foreign ideology. And once that kind of stuck a little bit, people were so scared and so intimidated, as they probably should have been, because the Klan was running rampant and tarring and feathering and whipping people who pertained to those foreign ideologies. It became this thing that no one wanted to have anything to do with. So just the slightest hint that somebody, might have that kind of red or even, so you say pink, just that pink shading was enough to just not hear the content of what they were going to say. But I'm interested in what you have to say about that, Roxanne.
Well, it was a context of a world revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution was in 1918. The Mexican Revolution was a socialist revolution, started in 1910 and went all through the teens. And they had links with each other. The IWW was linked up with the Magon brothers, who were Mexicans, but they were US citizens in San Diego.
Oh,
so there were all these, it was a time when Oklahoma was really cosmopolitan, even though it was mostly rural. But of course, the Mexican Revolution was mostly also rural peasantry. And they knew about each other, you know, they had exchanges, and socialism was all over the United States. But Oklahoma had the highest percentage of members in the Socialist Party of any state. And so that, you know, I knew those stories because my father told me about his father. And when the Klan was formed and then started attacking them, socialists had taken over the school board in the little town where I grew up, and they had actual firefights with the Ku Klux Klan, you know, trying to run them out. And so this county was kind of a microcosm of all over rural Oklahoma. And it was, you know, it was pretty much suppressed, and of course in the books and everything. But I think in the 50s, when I was, well, in the late 40s, when I was becoming an adolescent, he told me once not to share those stories with anyone, because this was the new Red Scare, you know, coming. So it was this thing of like, I knew and I couldn't share with anyone. And it was kind of strange. And he himself became pretty reactionary and voted for George Wallace in 1968, you know. So it was very confusing. But I think I've told young people in Oklahoma, go and ask, you know, the storyteller in your family to tell stories and urge them to talk about but they know that there are Reds in every closet in Oklahoma, including the Native people were very involved in especially the Red Sticks, the Seminoles, and the Creek Red Sticks, and they were very militant, and the Black socialists. So it's a story that's really inspiring, that I'm sure would, you know, really, there has been quite a lot of work among young people to revive it, but that's sort of been suppressed in the last few years. You know, it's sort of, I think, the Trump effect and the going even further to the right in Oklahoma. But I think it's another thing that makes Oklahoma in this sense of the compression, you know, and being a part of the world in a way that very few states in the United States were at the time. So there's the capitalists. One reason they came to Oklahoma, the socialists, to organize, is because it was the most developed capitalism in the United States. But I think also the rural people, the tenant farmers and sharecroppers, all that land was being taken from them, from self-subsistence to agribusiness, wheat and cotton. Cotton in the east part of the state, wheat in the west. And most of it automated, you know, becoming automated, the wheat becoming automated. So that, you know, it is a really interesting thing. But I think now we probably need to wrap up, and I want to ask you one more important thing, is what do you think of reconciliation? There's a lot of talk about reconciliation around the Tulsa race massacre. but also in general in Oklahoma, Native people, is there's still this, this friction and division, and how I think it's a moment right now with the opening of all the information about the Tulsa race riot to really talk about reconciliation and how that might happen. Do you have some ideas?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think before you can have reconciliation, you see this in other countries where there's been just a terrible history. You got to have truth. And, you have these processes in South Africa, and then in Canada with the residential schools of Indigenous kids. And Oklahoma, we're still struggling with the truth. And I think we're getting there. The thing that I find inspiring about Oklahoma is that there is this hunger for it. When I was growing up, it was like history had to be the most boring thing. Oh, we didn't want to study that. Like, there's nothing to see here. Now it's like, I feel like young people are so hungry for history. They want to know what really happened. And so as that truth, as we start to gain a kind of common foundation in that truth, we start to find ways to reconcile with one another, start to decolonize our way of thinking, indigenize our institutions, promote anti-racism in our schools, and start to, really improve. I think. I mean, it's never a smooth path, right? It's like you think we're going somewhere, and then all of a sudden we get certain politicians or certain laws will be enacted, and you think, well, that sets us back. But it's a long trajectory, and I think that it's I just look at people coming back to Oklahoma now that maybe would have left 20 years ago, and they're coming back, and they're coming back for, to see a future. So in spite of it all, I remain hopeful.
Yes, and it will be interesting to see do you have any advice that you would give as a university professor to professors and students and teachers in Oklahoma, how to react to Governor Stitt's or to the legislature's ban on critical race theory? And if you read the legislation, it goes into detail that anything that brings up race or racism makes people feel bad. So it should be banned.
Yeah, well, I think if you read the true history and you don't feel a twinge of something, I don't think you're reading it properly.
Right.
So, and how people are going to react, you can't control that. But I do think, I don't know, far be it for me to give advice, especially to teachers. You got teachers fight the good fight all the time, and they've got so much they got to deal with, and they're underpaid and they're underappreciated, and go teachers. But
right,
the truth is on your side. Let's just put it that way. The truth is on your side.
Well, thank you, Russ, and congratulations again. I wish we could be in Oklahoma, and it could be live, but hopefully next year the awards will be live, and I understand that they will bring you all down.
Oh, that would be wonderful. I'd love to meet you in person someday. Your work has been such an inspiration to me and to so many others. And I'm just really, truly grateful for this award and to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thanks.